Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
My name is Nate, I'm 28, and until recently, I thought I had my life reasonably on track. I had a job I didn't hate, an apartment I could afford on my own, and a small circle of friends who actually made me feel like I mattered. But that all came crashing down 2 weeks ago when my company announced sudden layoffs. One day I was punching in, the next I was walking out with a cardboard box of personal belongings and a polite handshake that felt emptier than the echo in the lobby behind me. I had no idea how I was going to handle the bills, the rent, or the crushing wave of embarrassment that followed me home like a shadow. And then, just as I was starting to process my sudden unemployment, my sister showed up at my door. My sister, Elise, is 5 years older than me, married, with 2 kids and a husband who apparently adores her but is allergic to responsibility. I don't think she's ever had to consider consequences beyond what affects her directly, and she has a knack for thinking the world revolves around her convenience. Seeing her standing in my hallway, practically glowing like she had just discovered a new planet, I should have known I was in trouble. "Hey, Nate," she said, flinging her arms wide as if she were embracing the entire universe in that one gesture. "I just booked our honeymoon. It's going to be amazing. But we need a favor." "Well, okay. More like you need a favor." She smiled, which in her vocabulary always meant she was about to unload something unreasonable. I braced myself. Okay, what is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though a small knot of dread had started forming in my stomach. "You can watch the kids while we're gone," she said, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. "We're leaving next week for 10 days, and I figured, since you're, you know, unemployed now, you've got nothing better to do, right?" Her eyes sparkled like she expected me to throw myself at the idea with gratitude. I had to fight the urge to laugh, or maybe scream. "I've got nothing better to do," she repeated, almost theatrically, like I should be jumping for joy at the prospect of being the live-in nanny for her 2 whirlwind children. I smiled politely, because what else could I do? My pride had just been trampled by the job market, and now it was about to get stomped on again by family entitlement. "Sure, I can help out," I said slowly, deliberately keeping my voice calm. I didn't say yes out of excitement. I said yes because I had an inkling that this was going to be one of those situations where anything less than agreement would result in guilt trips, passive-aggressive comments, and probably years of her reminding me how I had let her down. Elise didn't even pause to thank me. She went straight into planning mode, rattling off a list of rules, schedules, and expectations that made my head spin. They go to bed at 8, no screens after 7. You have to cook them breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and don't forget about baths. Oh, and the babysitter rates we pay? Forget about them, of course. Just do this because you're family. I felt my jaw tighten. Family. Right. Family apparently means free labor with no acknowledgement of your own struggles or dignity. I nodded along, letting her chatter wash over me while mentally filing away every irritating detail. Over the next hour, she pulled out charts, schedules, and even color-coded forms for me to fill out in advance. I kept smiling, because honestly, at this point, the only thing that kept me from snapping was the quiet, simmering thought that maybe, just maybe, I could turn this inconvenience into something for myself. It wasn't pride or malice, it was strategy. I had lost my job, sure, but my life didn't have to stop here. And if Elise thought she could stroll into my apartment, dump her responsibilities on me, and walk away thinking everything would go smoothly, well, she was about to find out how wrong she was. When she finally left, buzzing with excitement and leaving a trail of chaos behind her, I sat down heavily on the couch and stared at the schedule she'd left me. The kids' names were written in careful handwriting, meals were planned down to the minute, and every possible contingency had been accounted for. I let out a slow exhale. I wasn't angry yet, not fully, but something inside me clicked. I wasn't going to let her walk over me, not this time. And if she thought she was going to treat me like a convenience, she had another thing coming. Over the next few days, I watched Elise flit through the final preparations for her honeymoon, making calls to her spa, arranging flights, and texting me, "Don't forget." Reminders as if I were some sort of robotic assistant rather than her unemployed, stressed out brother. Every time she checked in, I forced a tight-lipped smile, storing every word, every infuriating assumption that I had nothing else to do, like fuel. By the time the kids arrived in my apartment for the first night, I had already begun plotting, not some childish revenge, but a slow, satisfying strategy that would make Elise think twice before assuming I was just there to be her unpaid helper. The night they arrived, I met them at the door, pretending to be cheerful and upbeat. "Hey guys, welcome," I said, and they practically barreled into the apartment, carrying every toy and backpack known to mankind. Elise waved at me once, smiling with that infuriating confidence, and then vanished out the door with a quick, "See you in 10 days. Don't get lost." And just like that, I was left with 2 kids, a mountain of expectations, and a sister who had already underestimated me. By the time I closed the door behind her, I allowed myself the tiniest smirk. If she thought she could hand me this disaster and come back to a perfect, stress-free environment, she was sorely mistaken. The first few days with the kids were an adjustment. I'd expected chaos, but I hadn't expected Elise's version of organized chaos. Everything had to be perfect, or at least perfect in the way she imagined it. Breakfast had to be precisely what she wrote on her color-coded chart, lunch couldn't deviate by even a few minutes, and bedtime had to be executed like a military operation. If I missed something, she was already planning her texts, which she called emergency updates, to remind me of my failures. I didn't mind the kids, not really. They were energetic, curious, and honestly kind of fun when they weren't bouncing off the walls screaming for candy at 7 in the morning. The problem wasn't the kids, it was Elise and the world she had created around them. I started keeping a mental tally of everything. How many times she had assumed I had nothing better to do. How many texts she sent before she even left the house. Don't forget baths. Remember no screens. Don't let Timmy watch TV during lunch. Every message carried that smug assumption that I existed only to serve her convenience. I tried to shrug it off, reminding myself I was unemployed and that, yes, technically, I did have time, but that didn't mean I had to accept being treated like a doormat. By day 3, the tipping point arrived. It was a Saturday morning, and I was elbow-deep in pancake batter, flipping them while Timmy and Lila were sitting at the counter, squabbling over who got the last strawberry. The kitchen was chaos, flour dusting the counters, and a sticky trail of syrup running down one side of the stove. I heard the familiar ping of a text and, with a groan, grabbed my phone. "Elise, don't let them eat too much sugar. Breakfast is only 300 calories each, remember, and brush teeth immediately after." I stared at the screen, disbelief washing over me. "They're 5, I muttered aloud, voice tight. "They can't count calories, Elise." I knew she wouldn't respond until later, probably with a lecture disguised as concern. I put the phone down, trying to ignore the simmering irritation building in my chest. The day didn't get easier. Timmy spilled juice all over the living room carpet, and Lila somehow managed to smear peanut butter across the sofa cushions. I was frantically cleaning up when I felt that familiar pang of exhaustion. I thought about calling a friend for a vent session, but the schedule Elise had left me made it impossible to take a break. The kids were supposed to have educational activities at 10, a snack at 11, lunch at noon, and then quiet reading time at 1. And, according to the chart, every single one of these tasks had to be timed down to the minute. I felt like a robot running on her instructions, and it was slowly chipping away at me. By the evening, I had finally managed to get them into bed after an epic struggle that involved bribery, negotiation, and a lot of pleading. I sank into the couch, exhausted, and scrolled through my phone to distract myself. That's when the call came. It was Elise. "Hey," she chirped, all sunshine and giggles. "Just checking in. You're surviving, right? Don't get overwhelmed." Her voice was bright, but underneath it, I could feel the judgment, the expectation that I was failing, that any slip-up would be entirely my fault. "I'm fine," I said, keeping my voice level, though my hands were shaking slightly from stress. "They're asleep now." "Oh, good, good," she said, and I could hear the distant clinking of wine glasses in the background. "I just wanted to let you know that we're having the best time." "You're doing great, really." But, try to make sure they stick to the schedule exactly. Lila mentioned she wants cereal before lunch, and Timmy said he wants to play video games. I felt my stomach twist. They can't have video games, Elise. And cereal before lunch isn't going to happen. Well, just try to make it fun for them, she said, breezing over my objection. I mean, I know it's hard for you, being at home all day with them. But, we really appreciate you doing this. And with that, she hung up, leaving me staring at the phone in stunned silence. She had just casually reminded me that my life was apparently so empty, so meaningless, that her chaos was a gift to me. That night, I lay awake on the couch, listening to the muffled snoring of the kids in their room, and I realized something. I was angry. Not just a little irritated, but truly burning angry. Elise had treated me like a disposable helper, like my own struggles and dignity were irrelevant. And yet, as angry as I was, a part of me also felt calculated. This was an opportunity, not an opportunity to punish her immediately. She deserved to be blindsided, but to show her, in a way she'd never forget, that I wasn't someone to be trifled with. The following days were a blur of increasingly absurd demands. Elise had decided that every night needed a family bonding activity over Zoom with her parents, who apparently lived for the chance to critique me. Every meal had to be photographed and sent to her, and every minor accident became a crisis text. The kids weren't to have candy, screen time, or even water outside of designated intervals. One afternoon, I found myself refereeing an argument over which crayon color was allowed, while juggling a temperamental slow cooker and a baby who had decided to throw her stuffed animals across the room like grenades. I tried reasoning. I tried humor. I tried patience. Nothing worked. Each day, Elise's messages grew more insistent, more condescending, more smug. And all the while, I began noticing small cracks in her carefully curated illusion of control. The kids would whisper things to me when they thought I wasn't listening. Small confessions about how Mom doesn't let us do anything fun, or Mom always tells us she's busy with her friends. I started keeping notes, mental snapshots of every ridiculous demand, every unreasonable expectation, every tiny injustice I endured. Then it happened, the breaking point. It was the 7th day, just as I was finishing a particularly exhausting dinner that involved Timmy refusing to eat his vegetables and Lila throwing spaghetti across the dining table. My phone buzzed, and I knew instantly who it was. Elise, of course. Her text was short, almost casual. We need to discuss something important when we get back. It's about the wedding gift you forgot to send. My brow furrowed. Wedding gift? I hadn't forgotten anything. My contribution had been taken care of weeks ago. I opened my email, checking the confirmation, and there it was, receipt and tracking number included. I double-checked everything, my heart sinking, because I knew where this was heading. Elise had just assumed, without asking, without verifying, that I had failed to do something for her. I called her, my voice tight but controlled. Elise, I sent the gift. Here's the tracking number. It's on the way. Oh, well, I just had a feeling. I mean, you've been so busy with the kids, she started, in that infuriatingly casual, dismissive tone. That's exactly the point. I cut in, my patience snapping like a brittle branch. I am busy. I'm doing exactly what you asked. But instead of acknowledging that, you assume I'm failing. You act like I exist only to serve your convenience. I'm not a robot, Elise. I'm not your unpaid helper, and I'm not someone you can guilt or manipulate because I'm unemployed. There was silence on the line. I could hear her inhale sharply, as if my words had punched her in the chest. Well, I just thought, she stammered, a rare crack in her confident facade. No, I said firmly. You thought I'd fail because you decided my life was meaningless without a job. You treated me like my struggles didn't matter, like I didn't have feelings or dignity. And you did it with a smile, thinking I'd just take it. You can think whatever you want, but I'm not falling for it. I'm not letting you walk all over me anymore. She hung up. I sat there in stunned silence, heart racing, staring at my phone. I felt a surge of power, of clarity. For the first time during this entire ordeal, I wasn't just surviving her chaos. I was seeing the pattern, seeing exactly how she underestimated me, how she assumed she could control every detail of my life because I was at her mercy. And in that moment, I knew things were about to change. Slowly, deliberately, I began forming a plan, a way to make her regret every single condescending assumption she had ever made about me. By the time the kids had finally settled into bed that night, exhausted from their own whirlwind of rules and restrictions, I had scribbled a list of every grievance, every oversight, every ridiculous expectation. I wasn't planning revenge for revenge's sake. I was planning a demonstration, one that would show Elise exactly what happens when she treats people like disposable tools, when she assumes her convenience is more important than someone else's dignity. And yet, as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, I felt the first real twinge of excitement I had experienced since losing my job. Not excitement at chaos, but at the thought of reclaiming control, turning her own assumptions and arrogance against her in a way she would never see coming. I knew that the next week would be critical, the point where everything would either explode or tip irrevocably in my favor. And I also knew that Elise had no idea just how underestimated I truly was. The days after Elise's call were quiet on the surface, but turbulent beneath. I didn't talk about what she'd said to anyone, didn't complain, and didn't let the kids see it either. I kept smiling, even when my chest ached from exhaustion and my patience was threadbare. Part of me hated the situation I was in, the uncertainty of unemployment, the relentless demands of babysitting, the knowledge that my sister thought so little of me. But another part of me felt a strange clarity. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just a chore or an insult. It was a challenge. And like most challenges, the only way to get through it was to take control in the one way I still could: my own mind, my own actions, my own patience. I began keeping a journal, not for Elise, not for anyone but me. Each day, I wrote down every incident, what happened, how it made me feel, what I observed about the kids, and every assumption Elise had made about me. I wrote about the little victories, the moments when Timmy finally sat through reading time without whining, or when Lila managed to eat a full dinner without throwing half of it across the room. I wrote about how exhausting it was, and I also wrote about the sparks of pride I felt when I handled a crisis calmly instead of panicking. Slowly, the journal became a mirror of my own resilience, a record of strength I hadn't fully acknowledged in myself before. The first few days of reflection weren't glamorous or empowering. They were painful. The truth was that I was lonely, and there were nights when I questioned my worth. Elise had a way of making me feel small, and unemployment had left me vulnerable in ways I hadn't anticipated. But at the same time, I noticed a shift in my perspective. I wasn't just the unemployed sibling, the default babysitter, the punching bag for Elise's assumptions. I was learning to rely on myself, to trust my judgment, to carve out a space where my efforts, no matter how small, mattered. It was the first real sense of autonomy I had felt in months. I started experimenting with small improvements to my routine with the kids, things that Elise would have dismissed as unnecessary or frivolous. I introduced simple cooking hacks that made meals faster and more fun, and I found ways to turn educational activities into games so the kids stayed engaged without constant nagging. I realized that when I stopped trying to follow Elise's rigid schedule to the letter and instead focused on what actually worked for them and me, I was happier, and so were the kids. Laughter replaced whining at breakfast. Timmy started helping Lila when she struggled with homework, and even in her absence, I could sense the kids noticing the difference, their trust in me growing. Still, every success I experienced was accompanied by a shadow: Elise's texts. She hadn't yet returned from her honeymoon, and in the gaps between her photos of sunlit beaches and endless cocktails, she sent the occasional check-in. Her tone was casual, almost teasing, but every message carried a sting, a reminder that she was watching from afar, judging from a distance, and that she assumed she still had control. I started reading her messages with a detached, almost strategic eye, cataloging them in my mental ledger, waiting for the perfect moment to leverage every assumption she had ever made. And then, one afternoon, I hit rock bottom. It wasn't Elise's texts or the relentless schedule, or even the chaos of two energetic children. It was something quieter, something more insidious, the crushing weight of self-doubt. I had applied to dozens of jobs, sent out cover letters, gone to interviews, and each time been met with silence or polite rejection. I realized that losing my job wasn't just a temporary setback. It was a reflection of a system that seemed determined to overlook my skills, my value, and my experience. I felt invisible, expendable, and frankly, like a failure. That evening, after the kids had finally gone to bed, I sat on the couch and stared blankly at the wall. For the first time, tears came unbidden. I felt small, powerless, and defeated. I questioned whether I was capable of anything meaningful, whether I could ever reclaim the dignity and respect Elise seemed to take for granted. And yet, somewhere beneath the exhaustion and despair, there was a flicker, a quiet, stubborn refusal to give up entirely. It started with small steps. I rearranged my apartment to make it more efficient for the kids, turning chaos into a system that worked for me, not just for Elise's imagined perfection. I started exercising in the mornings, something I had neglected, and even a short jog around the neighborhood brought a sense of clarity and control. I began cooking more confidently, experimenting with new recipes that weren't in Elise's color-coded charts, and watching the kids' eyes light up at something they actually enjoyed. Every small victory built momentum, and slowly, imperceptibly, my confidence began returning. I also reached out to old contacts from my previous job, networking discreetly, reconnecting with people who knew my abilities and my work ethic. Every coffee meeting, every email sent, every casual conversation was a reminder that the world outside Elise's assumptions still recognized my value. I didn't brag or boast, but I carefully collected evidence of my worth, knowing that it would become useful later, both for my self-esteem and for the eventual confrontation with my sister. By the end of the week, the change was tangible. The kids were calmer, happier, and actually listening to instructions, not out of fear or coercion, but because I had found a way to earn their respect. I realized that my sense of self-worth didn't have to be dictated by Elise or anyone else. I had agency, skill, and creativity, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of genuine pride. It was during one quiet moment, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while the kids napped, that I began to map out the next phase. Elise's assumptions, her smug confidence that I was powerless, that I would obediently follow her orders, were weaknesses. They were blind spots that I could exploit. I didn't want revenge in the petty sense. I wanted a demonstration, a carefully orchestrated lesson that would reveal how much she had underestimated me. Every late-night text she had sent, every implicit insult, every unacknowledged effort would be part of the record. I started to think of it almost like chess, each move deliberate, each response calculated, with the goal of reaching a checkmate she would never see coming. And yet, I couldn't rush it. Part of the power of the plan lay in patience, in the slow build-up, in letting her arrogance and entitlement become more extreme while I quietly strengthened my position. I began documenting every small victory with the kids, every improvement I made, and every minor slip or assumption Elise made in her communications. I even started saving receipts and photographs as evidence, not for a legal fight, but for the eventual reveal, a way to prove that I had not only survived her absurd expectations, but had quietly exceeded them on my own terms. By the end of the second week, I felt like a different person, not someone who had simply endured Elise's chaos, but someone who had reclaimed control over my own life. I had faced self-doubt, exhaustion, and emotional manipulation and survived. I had discovered a quiet strength, a clarity of purpose, and the knowledge that I was capable of far more than Elise, or anyone else, had ever given me credit for. And that's when the first real opportunity presented itself. It was subtle, almost mundane, but I recognized it immediately. Elise had left a document on the kitchen counter before she left, a permission slip for a local kids' activity, signed incorrectly, with her husband's name instead of hers in the parent section. She assumed I would correct it without question or fail to notice. I didn't panic. I didn't get flustered. Instead, I tucked it away, filing it in my mental archive. One day, she would need that document, and one day, she would realize that her assumption of my compliance had been her first critical mistake. I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years. Not just revenge, but control. Not just victory, but proof. The stage was being set, and I was finally ready to direct the play. Elise's smug confidence, her entitlement, and her assumptions about my worth would soon collide with a version of me she had never anticipated. And I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when it finally happened. The plan didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments, little bright ideas that fitted together like pieces of a puzzle when I wasn't looking. After 2 weeks of sleep deprivation, passive-aggressive texts, and the slow, steady burn of resentment, I realized the thing Elise feared most wasn't that I'd fail at babysitting. It was being ignored, being invisible. She thrived on control and attention. So whatever I did needed to be quiet, precise, and visible in the places that mattered to her. Family, friends, and that curated image she kept projecting on social media. I wanted to do something that would undermine that image without stooping to petty cruelty. I didn't want to humiliate for sport. I wanted to expose the assumption that my life was inconsequential and show everyone, starting with Elise, that I wasn't what she thought I was. The first move was the easiest: documentation. I turned my frustration into evidence. Every text, every schedule she sent, every little dictate, I saved. Not for the sake of revenge alone, but to build a record I could present calmly and clearly when the time came. I took photos of the kids' artwork, of the messes that had become manageable under my watch, of the improvised crafts that actually held their attention for longer than her structured activities. I kept receipts for groceries, for the extra crayons I bought when the old box broke, for the impromptu craft supplies that had transformed tantrums into cooperative projects. I labeled everything and started a folder on my laptop called 10 Days. It felt strangely empowering to convert chaos into order. Next, I recruited allies, not conspirators, but people who could corroborate what I'd been doing and help me build momentum without it feeling staged. I reached out to Marco, an old co-worker who'd always been blunt but fair. He owed me a favor after I covered for him on a project last year, and he was the kind of person who understood nuance and would happily help me rebuild my confidence if I asked. I didn't tell him about any grand plan. I told him, honestly, that I was scraping by and needed a reference or a freelance lead. He obliged, and suddenly I had someone in my corner who could vouch for my work ethic. Not because he felt sorry for me, but because he respected me. Then there was Lena, my neighbor from 2 floors down. Lena was a single mom with bright eyes and zero patience for entitlement. She'd watched me struggle through late nights caring for kids in the laundry room lobby when I left them with a babysitter once, and she'd always admired how calm I'd stayed. I asked if she'd be willing to stop by one afternoon for coffee and keep an ear on things, something casual. "I'm trying to document how I manage solo for a little project," I said, which was mostly true. She agreed without hesitation and, true to form, she turned into more than an ear. She started helping with the kids' afternoon reading sessions and brought over small puzzles that actually kept them engaged. She became part of the narrative I was quietly building. People saw me manage, assist, and improve the kids' days in ways that Elise hadn't bothered to notice. I also took advantage of the community that existed everywhere if you know where to look. There was a local parenting group on social media I'd scrolled through before out of curiosity. I made a post, not a lament, not a plea, but a practical, upbeat update, trying out a few home activities that got great reactions from 2 energetic kids. Anyone tried miniature gardening with toddlers? I shared a couple of photos of makeshift planters using recycled yogurt cups, and within an hour I had half a dozen comments with tips and a message from a community organizer asking if I'd consider bringing the activity to the neighborhood center for a small kids session. It was small, but it showed that my efforts had value beyond the apartment. I accepted, booking a Saturday slot under Uncle Nate's mini garden. The organizer wanted a short write-up and a photo for the center's newsletter. I had both. Everything was being steered subtly toward an important truth. I wasn't just surviving Elise's expectations. I was improving on them in ways that mattered. I wanted the evidence to be undeniable, but the method to be graceful. I refused to make this about catching Elise in a lie or bungling. That would feed her drama-hungry tendencies. Instead, I was assembling a quiet, indisputable narrative: receipts, messages, testimonials, photos, and community recognition. It would culminate in a reveal that showed I had not only coped, but created something positive from the predicament she'd handed me. I rehearsed how I present it. I pictured sending a single, composed email to Elise and to a handful of family members, photographs attached, a short timeline, receipts, quotes from friends and the community page, and a simple subject line. 10 days with the kids. What happened? No accusations, no theatrics. Just facts, laid out cleanly. I imagined her seeing it and realizing she'd misjudged and underestimated me. The result I wanted wasn't shame, it was reappraisal. I wanted people to look at me differently. And for that to happen, the evidence had to be compelling and unassailable. To make sure the presentation couldn't be dismissed as mere social media showboating, I arranged a couple of low-key but strategic endorsements. Marco agreed to write a brief message about my reliability and problem-solving skills. A short paragraph he was fine sharing with family if I asked. Lena volunteered to be a character witness for the kids' improved behavior and enjoyment. The community organizer, a woman named Priya who ran the kids' club, promised to include a blurb in the newsletter about the success of the mini garden session. It felt oddly like building a case, but it was really about truth and proof. Elise had built her life around crafted perceptions. I was building something real and giving others the chance to see it for themselves. There was one more piece I needed, something Elise had left behind that would be inconvenient enough to highlight her assumptions, but not so harsh as to be cruel. Remember the permission slip I'd found on the counter with the wrong signature? It was a small administrative error, but it was emblematic. She assumed I'd fix whatever she messed up, and she assumed I wouldn't notice. I kept the slip in my folder. The local activity I'd scheduled at the community center required exactly that kind of paperwork for child attendance and parental consent. I reached out to the center, explained the situation without drama, and asked what they would require if a delegated guardian signed in for a child's activity. The woman at the desk gave me the bureaucratic list: proof of guardianship for regulars, and an on-the-spot consent form for temporary caregivers, signed by the parent at drop-off. Perfect. It meant Elise's oversight could become a teachable hiccup rather than an emergency, and it would prove one more point. Assumptions about responsibility have consequences. With the paperwork step clarified, I moved to timing. Elise's flight home was scheduled to land on a Sunday evening. The community center activity was the Saturday before. The plan was simple: execute the event, gather the small but powerful endorsements, compile everything into the 10 days folder, and email it to Elise and a select group of family members the morning after the event. The message would be calm and factual. I would let the photos, receipts, and testimonies speak. No accusations, no baiting. If Elise wanted to respond angrily, that would be on her. My job was to present a truth she could not easily refute. I also built in a contingency. Elise loved drama and loved to spin narratives online about her perfect family life. So I prepared a private message to her husband, not accusatory, just factual and polite, letting him know I'd be sending a summary email about the kids and the activities I'd organized. I wasn't trying to pit anyone against her. I wanted accountability and clarity. If he cared about practicalities, he'd read it and see the truth. If he didn't, fine, the evidence would still be there for parents, friends, and the neighborhood community. The more I planned, the quieter the thrill became. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about reclaiming dignity and making the invisible visible. The quietest victories are often the most satisfying. On Saturday, the mini garden session went better than I'd dared hope. The kids, Elise's included, were fully engaged, their faces smudged with soil and their fingers stained green with chlorophyll. Parents lingered longer than expected, complimenting the simplicity of the activity and the kids' enthusiasm. Priya snapped candid photos and handed me a small note to include in the newsletter. Lena narrated a quick line to a neighbor who happened to stop in and later texted me that she'd happily drop a message for me if I wanted. Marco sent a short voice note commending how I'd handled the kids and the logistics, and I saved it like treasure. Everything slotted into place. That night, after the kids were asleep and the apartment was tidy for once, I assembled the email. 10 days with the kids. What happened? I typed, attached photos of the garden project, a PDF of receipts, a screenshot of Marco's message, Priya's blurb, and Lena's casual note. I wrote a concise timeline of events and included the permission slip with a short note about the center's requirement. Nothing accusatory, simply informative. This is what was needed and here's how it was handled. I hovered over the send button for a long minute. I thought about the consequences, about how Elise might react, about the family gossip that could follow. I thought about the pride that had been slowly returning to me, how it felt like a muscle I'd been exercising. I didn't want to humiliate her. I wanted to correct a narrative that had been unfairly constructed about my worth. My finger clicked. The email went out to Elise, her husband, my parents, and a few relatives who were used to being practical rather than performative. Then I waited. It felt both mundane and monumental, like dropping a pebble in a still pond and watching the ripples spread. I went to bed that night with a steady, nervous energy. The next morning there was a text from Lena. Good luck. They'll see. Marco pinged. Nicely done. Proud of you. My phone buzzed with likes and comments on the community post. It felt surreal to be celebrated for something that had begun as an imposition. And then, mid-afternoon, as I was making a list of final things to tidy before Elise's return, my phone lit up with a message that made my stomach drop and my pulse quicken. Elise had sent a short text. Only 3 words. We land early. No details, no niceties. My chest tightened because that meant my window for the reveal had shrunk. The family would read my email that morning, talk, and then she would step back into a world that had already started shifting its view of me. The plan had been scheduled carefully, but life has a way of rearranging the pieces. I sat down, folder open on my lap, and watched the clock. Everything felt poised on a knife edge. I'd laid the groundwork. I'd gathered allies and assembled proof. I'd chosen dignity over drama. Now all that remained was to see what happened when Elise walked back into a home and a family narrative that no longer fit her neat assumptions. Sunday morning began with a calm that felt almost unnatural. I'd spent the night double-checking my folder, making sure every attachment, every photo, every receipt, every endorsement from Marco, Lena, and Priya was perfectly organized. The email had already gone out the previous day, quietly waiting in the inboxes of Elise, her husband, and our family. I didn't need to watch it go viral or to stalk open notifications. I had built my case carefully, and now it was a matter of letting the evidence speak. The kids were unusually quiet that morning, perhaps sensing the tension I hadn't even admitted to myself. I gave them breakfast, simple but cheerful, and watched them scatter afterward, happily absorbed in a craft activity I'd set up. There was no chaos, no tears, no scolding. It was a small victory, but one that reminded me that the work I'd done over the last 2 weeks wasn't just for a grand reveal. It had tangible, positive results. The kids were thriving under my guidance, in ways Elise had never considered possible. That realization alone filled me with a quiet sense of satisfaction. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed repeatedly. I ignored it for a moment, allowing the room to breathe and the kids to focus. But eventually curiosity got the better of me. My inbox had blown up. The family thread had erupted. Wow, I didn't know. Nate, this is incredible. Why didn't anyone tell me he could handle this? The messages were polite, impressed, and, most importantly, undeniable. The photos, receipts, and testimonials I'd compiled left no room for argument. Elise's meticulous attempts to present herself as the indispensable parent had crumbled under the weight of simple, factual proof. I had not only managed, but exceeded expectations. I saw the text from Elise herself. What is this? 3 words. No preamble, no tone, just confusion and, I suspected, the first trace of panic. I smiled, leaning back in my chair as the kids played nearby. Calmly, I opened a reply, careful not to be dramatic. It's what happened while you were away. I followed your instructions, kept everything organized, and handled the kids' activities meals, and schedules. The attachments include receipts, photos, and notes from friends and neighbors who helped or witnessed the activities. Everything was managed successfully, and no emergencies occurred. There was a pause. Then another message. This isn't fair. You made it sound like we weren't needed. You said I had nothing better to do? I replied simply. I followed your instructions exactly as you outlined them. I didn't do anything outside what you requested, yet I still created something positive and verifiable. The family and community have already recognized this. I merely documented the results. Her text slowed, becoming increasingly fragmented. I don't understand. How did you? Careful planning, dedication, and attention to detail, I wrote. The same qualities you assume I lack whenever convenient for you. By the time Elise landed in town that evening, her confidence had cracked. The first thing she noticed was the calmness of the apartment. The kids were happily occupied, everything was clean, and the place ran smoothly. It was almost disorienting, the very opposite of the chaos she had anticipated leaving behind. Her smile faltered as she scanned the room. Then her phone buzzed, and she checked the family group thread. "What is all this?" she asked, voice a little higher than normal, almost shaky. "Evidence of how I managed the kids while you were gone," I said, keeping my tone steady. I documented every day, every task, every activity. Photos, receipts, feedback from friends and neighbors, and the local community center. Everything you assumed I wouldn't handle or wouldn't do. Her jaw tightened. "But these messages, it makes it look like what actually happened," I interrupted. "I did exactly what you asked. I handled the kids, the schedule, and even improved their activities. I didn't fail. You assumed I would. And now the record shows your assumption was wrong." She looked around, disbelief written across her face. This isn't how it's supposed to be. I was supposed to be appreciated for assuming I couldn't manage. I finished. "I'm sorry, Elise. I don't operate on assumptions. I operate on results. You treated me as someone who had nothing better to do, as someone whose value could be ignored. That assumption cost you credibility with the family and the community, and it's entirely on you." Her husband stepped in, looking uncomfortable as the gravity of the situation became clear. "Well, I suppose he's right. Everything seems handled." Elise's face flushed, a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief. "Handled, yes, but it's not the same. I mean, I planned all of it. And that planning didn't account for execution," I said, quietly but firmly. "I took your instructions and turned them into a real, functioning reality. You assumed you were indispensable. You weren't. You assumed I would fail without supervision. I didn't." The family, who had been silently observing this exchange, began murmuring amongst themselves. Comments like, "Nate really did a great job," and "I didn't expect him to manage everything," floated through the room. Elisa's authority, which she had assumed was absolute, was quietly and completely undermined. Her entitlement, her assumption that I would serve her whims because I had nothing else going on, was on full display, and everyone could see it. Then came the final piece. I pulled out the permission slip from my folder, neatly folded and still in pristine condition. "This," I said, "is the document you left and signed correctly. It was required for the local activity I organized. I handled it properly, with the center's approval. Everything was managed efficiently, even the things you assumed I would overlook or fail to correct." Her eyes widened. You handled the paperwork." "Yes," I said, "just as I handled the kids, their schedules, and the activities. I didn't complain. I didn't beg. I didn't fail. I just did what needed to be done, and I did it well." For a long moment, she stared at me. I could see the panic building in her chest, a silent recognition of her error. She had misjudged me completely, assumed my life was meaningless without a job, assumed my time and skills were disposable. Every assumption she'd made about me over the last 2 weeks had been proven wrong in a single, composed display of competence. Her husband cleared his throat, stepping in softly. "Elise, maybe you underestimated Nate. He managed this perfectly. Maybe it's time to recognize that." Her face flushed red, and she opened her mouth, probably to protest, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. I simply smiled. Calm, quiet, undeniably confident. The kids ran past, laughing, chasing each other with homemade soil-covered planters, a testament to the simple, effective, and joyful work I had done. For the first time in years, Elise had no words. Her entitlement had collided with reality, and reality had won. The family, silent witnesses to the unspoken truth, nodded in quiet acknowledgement of my competence. I felt a warmth spread through me, not from triumph over her, but from the satisfaction of finally being seen for what I was capable of, finally proving my value without stooping to insult, manipulation, or drama. In that moment, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't about making Elise feel small. It wasn't about humiliating her in front of the family. Revenge, the way I had orchestrated it, was about reclaiming dignity, demanding respect, and demonstrating competence in a way that left no doubt. It was about quiet power, measured execution, and undeniable results. And for once, the balance had shifted. Elise stood there, speechless, as I handed her a folder containing the neatly compiled documentation, the photos, the receipts, the messages, the testimonials, and the corrected permission slip. "Read it when you have time," I said, voice even. "It's all there. The facts speak for themselves." She looked at me, mouth opening, closing, opening again. Finally, she swallowed and muttered, I didn't realize you didn't have to," I said, smiling gently. "Now you do." And in that instant, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The family had witnessed a shift, subtle but undeniable, from assumed inferiority to proven capability. Elise's assumptions, her smug confidence, and her entitlement had been dismantled not through confrontation or rage, but through calm, careful, intelligent action. As I watched her walk toward the door, still processing, I felt a sense of closure unlike anything I had experienced in years. I had endured chaos, fatigue, and condescension. I had faced self-doubt and the specter of failure. And through it all, I had built something lasting, proof of my competence, respect earned, and dignity restored. The kids ran to me, holding up their tiny garden planters like trophies. I ruffled their hair, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. Elise's disbelief lingered in the background, but I didn't need her validation anymore. The work I'd done, the calm execution, and the undeniable evidence were all the validation I could ever need. And as I watched her leave, I realized the most important truth of all. People who underestimate you often do so with the loudest confidence, but true power lies in patience, planning, and quiet execution. I leaned back on the couch, the kids laughing nearby, and smiled. This time, I had won. Not just the battle, but the war of perception, respect, and dignity, and nothing, not even Elise, could ever take that away from me. My name's Kyle, I'm 28, and I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I had to draw a line with my own family. But here I am, standing in my living room, heart racing, trying to keep my voice steady while staring at the people who were supposed to be closest to me. It all started with my brother, Jason. He's 34, always had this way of thinking he's the head of the family, the one whose opinions matter the most, and the rest of us are just background noise. Growing up, Mom used to protect me from a lot of his worst behavior. She'd swoop in when he tried to get us in trouble, when he made fun of me for small things, or when he decided to borrow stuff without asking and then blamed me if it disappeared. But Mom's gone now, and suddenly the family dynamics that had been lurking in the shadows were exposed for what they really were. And Jason? He didn't waste a second to make sure I knew I was still on the bottom. It was a Monday morning when it all came to a head. I'd just lost my job after months of quietly trying to hold on, and I was emotionally raw, more vulnerable than I wanted to admit. Mom's death 2 years ago had left a void that Jason never acknowledged. To him, it seemed, life was supposed to carry on like nothing had happened. But I had been holding on to memories, to small things that mattered, and for the first time, I realized I couldn't just let his arrogance slide anymore. That morning, Jason had shown up unannounced at my apartment with that smug, superior look he always gets when he thinks he's about to teach me a lesson or get me to cave to his whims. "You've got nothing better to do today, right?" he said, tossing a set of keys onto my counter. "I've got a couple of errands. And Mom always used to say you were good at handling things like this. I froze, keys clattering like a warning bell. The words stung, not because he was asking me for help, but because of the way he said, Mom always used to say, as if my own worth was tied to her approval alone. And of course, I knew he was baiting me, seeing how low I could sink without her there to intervene. I didn't say anything at first. I just let him leave the keys on the counter and walked around the apartment, gripping them in my hand, replaying every subtle dig he'd ever made since we were kids. It wasn't just the little things, like claiming my achievements didn't matter or mocking my choices. It was the cumulative effect of a lifetime of being second in every way. My anger simmered under the surface, a quiet determination that I wouldn't let him, or anyone else in my family, treat me like that anymore. I realized I had to set boundaries, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I couldn't let his arrogance overshadow my own life any longer. A few days later, I found out Jason had been quietly meddling in Mom's estate. After her passing, she had left behind a series of instructions that were meant to protect me, small things that guaranteed I had a stake in the things she cared about. Jason, of course, had assumed he could manipulate the situation in his favor. He'd gone behind my back, questioning lawyers, intercepting documents, and talking to relatives as though I didn't exist. When I confronted him about it over the phone, he laughed like it was a joke. "You think Mom cared more about you than me? You're dreaming, Kyle." That was the moment I realized I had to take matters into my own hands. I started gathering evidence quietly. Copies of documents, emails, receipts, anything that showed Jason's interference. Each piece made my resolve stronger, a steady, controlled rage building inside me that wasn't destructive, it was strategic. I wanted him to understand, finally, that the games he had played his whole life had consequences. I wasn't going to scream or cry. I was going to act, and I was going to make sure it hit him in the one place he always underestimated: the truth. The day I decided to confront him, I had everything laid out in front of me. The photos of him taking things that weren't his, the signed papers, the emails showing his manipulation. Dad sat silently beside me, the kind of quiet that made me nervous, because I'd learned over the years that silence from him could mean agreement with Jason, or worse, that he was planning to intervene in a way that would derail everything. I took a deep breath, making sure my nerves didn't betray me. When Jason walked in, that familiar smirk plastered across his face. I could see the first hint of challenge in his eyes. He thought this was just another day of asserting dominance over me. I spoke calmly, more calmly than I felt. "Apologize for what you did to Mom, or leave my house." The words sounded colder and firmer than I expected, but my hand didn't shake as I set the photos and papers on the table between us. Jason scoffed immediately, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. "You think you're better than us now?" he said, voice dripping with contempt. I ignored the jab, focusing on the calm, controlled fire in my chest. Dad didn't say a word, and for a moment, I thought he might intervene, but he didn't. Jason's eyes flicked to the papers, then back to me, trying to gauge my mood, my confidence. He clearly hadn't expected me to confront him directly, to have the evidence laid out, to have my voice steady and unwavering. 10 minutes into this silent standoff, I noticed a flicker of something in his face, a hesitation, a crack in the armor he always presented. My heart pounded in my chest, not with fear, but with anticipation. I had the upper hand, finally, but I knew better than to rush it. This wasn't about an instant victory. It was about letting him feel the weight of his actions, about giving him a moment to squirm under the truth he had spent years ignoring. And yet, even as I watched him falter slightly, I felt a twinge of unease. This was only the beginning. The real challenge would be maintaining control, keeping him off balance while revealing just enough for him to understand the stakes. I could see his mind working, calculating, probably trying to think of ways to twist the situation, to gaslight me, to make it look like I was overreacting. But this time, I was prepared. Every argument he might throw, every sneer or accusation, I had anticipated. I had the documents, the photos, the proof of his entitlement, his greed, and his disrespect. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a reckoning. As the minutes dragged on, the air in the room grew heavier. Jason's posture stiffened, his confidence visibly waning, but he wasn't about to back down completely. "You really think showing me a bunch of papers is going to change anything?" he said finally, trying to muster a laugh, though it sounded forced. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let my silence speak, letting the weight of the evidence settle in. The photographs, the signed papers, they weren't just objects. They were proof that his actions had consequences, that the past couldn't be erased by arrogance or entitlement. For the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in Jason. It wasn't defeat yet, but it was close. And I realized something about myself in that moment. I wasn't just standing up to him for Mom or for the estate. I was standing up for myself, for every time I'd felt small, powerless, dismissed. I wasn't going to allow history to repeat itself. I would make him accountable, not out of revenge in the traditional sense, but to establish a boundary that had been ignored for decades. The tension in the room was palpable. Dad's silence weighed like a third presence, neutral but undeniable, and Jason's eyes darted nervously between me, the documents, and Dad. He could feel the walls closing in, though he'd never admit it. And in that moment, I realized the true power of patience and preparation. I had spent years underestimating myself, letting Jason's arrogance dominate my life. Now, I had taken control, carefully, methodically, and I could feel the shift in the balance of power. Jason's face went pale, a reaction that made my stomach twist with satisfaction, but I didn't give him the relief of immediate confrontation. I waited, letting the suspense stretch, letting him realize that he wasn't in charge anymore. My hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, steady and deliberate, while he fidgeted, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The next move was his to make, or to fail, and I knew, deep down, that when he finally did act, he would realize just how outmatched he was. The tension in the room lingered, thick enough to taste, even as Jason finally exhaled, a long, slow sigh that sounded more like defeat than relief. I didn't move, I didn't speak. I let him stew in the silence because I wanted him to feel it fully, that moment of vulnerability he had spent years avoiding, hiding behind arrogance and entitlement. For a second, I thought maybe Dad would finally intervene, say something to defuse the situation, but he remained still, silent as always, like he was weighing every word, every gesture. I had always hated that about him. The way he pretended neutrality while his silence often enabled Jason's worst impulses. But today, I didn't need him. I had prepared too carefully, and I knew that, finally, the truth alone would shake Jason in a way words never could. After a long pause, Jason leaned back, his jaw tight. "You really think Mom would have wanted you making these decisions? You're just her favorite, right? That's why you got all the attention." His voice had that familiar edge of mockery, but this time, it faltered just a little at the end, betraying the cracks in his confidence. I felt the anger rise, but tempered it with cold focus. "This isn't about favoritism," I said evenly. "It's about fairness, about the things Mom wanted. You're the one trying to rewrite the rules after she's gone." He scoffed again, but I noticed the difference this time. It wasn't genuine laughter. It was strained, defensive. Jason had always relied on intimidation and ridicule to dominate any conversation, to make people doubt themselves. But now, I was standing solid, unmoved. I could see the calculations in his eyes. How to spin this, how to make it seem like I was overreacting, like I was ungrateful, like I was still small and insignificant. But the papers, the photos, the evidence, they couldn't be argued with. And that, I realized, was why he was struggling. For the next several hours, we went back and forth, a tense, slow battle of wills. Jason tried to charm, to manipulate, to guilt me. "You don't need this money or property, Kyle. You've always had it easy," he said at one point, smirking as if he were telling a joke. But I saw right through it. I'd spent my whole life watching him twist words, and now, I had the tools to counter him. I calmly reminded him of the things he had taken, the decisions he had made, the moments he had tried to erase from our family history. Each point landed with quiet precision, a sting he couldn't shrug off. Dad finally spoke around late afternoon, his voice low and careful. Jason, maybe Kyle has a point. Maybe you should consider what he's saying. It wasn't a declaration, not really, but it was enough to make Jason's face twitch with annoyance. Dad had rarely sided with me, and even this small acknowledgement was like lighting a fuse. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line, his nostrils flaring slightly, as he tried to regain control. I don't need lectures from either of you, he said, but there was a hesitation in his tone that hadn't been there before. Hours turned into evening, and the tension didn't let up. I could feel it in my bones, the kind of pressure that builds when long-suppressed resentment and entitlement meet an unmovable force. I kept my voice steady, kept my posture relaxed but deliberate. Every time Jason opened his mouth, I countered with facts, with evidence, with calm reminders of his manipulations. And every time, I saw it in his face. The pride he'd worn like armor was chipping, leaving fear and anger underneath. That night, after he left my apartment with a tight, forced smile, I thought the confrontation was over. But I was wrong. The next morning, I discovered that Jason had gone to the extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, telling his version of events. He painted me as the villain, accusing me of overreacting, of trying to claim what wasn't mine, of being ungrateful and spiteful. For a moment, I felt that old sting, the isolation I'd always felt when Jason rallied everyone against me. But I quickly reminded myself that I wasn't powerless anymore. I had evidence, and I had the moral high ground. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, I received a call from a mutual cousin, a distant family member who had always been neutral, sometimes even sympathetic toward me. Their voice trembled on the line. "Kyle, Jason, he's done something. He's taken the signed papers from Dad's safe. He's trying to file them as if they're his. He's saying Mom wanted him to have everything, to bypass you entirely." My stomach dropped. I felt a mixture of fury and disbelief. I had known Jason would try to manipulate things, but I hadn't expected him to commit such a blatant betrayal so quickly and so ruthlessly. I called Dad immediately. His voice was cautious, measured. "I know, Jason thinks he can get away with it, but we can stop him." There was no urgency, no panic, just a weight of responsibility, of finally being forced to confront decades of silence and favoritism. I realized that my father, who had always been a quiet enabler, was finally acknowledging the truth, though too late to prevent Jason from trying. That alone lit a fire in me. Anger not just at Jason, but at the years of neglect and misplaced priorities that had allowed this to happen. I spent that night preparing for the confrontation I knew had to come next. I printed out copies of every document, organized the photos of Jason taking liberties he had no right to, and even reached out to a lawyer for advice, something I had avoided doing before because I thought it would be too confrontational, too aggressive. But now, it was necessary. I couldn't leave my life, my mother's wishes, or my own dignity in the hands of someone who had spent decades undermining me. By the time Jason arrived the next day, I was ready. He walked in with that smug, confident air he always wore like armor, unaware of the storm waiting for him. "So, what's all this?" he asked casually, glancing at the stack of documents on the table. I ignored his tone, letting the calm authority in my voice do the work. "You've gone too far this time, Jason. I've collected everything. Photos, papers, communications. Everything you've done to manipulate Mom's estate, to try to erase me from it. Apologize for what you did, or leave my house." He laughed at first, a nervous laugh, clearly expecting me to cave. But when I didn't respond, when I simply sat back and let the silence stretch, I saw the shift. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the twitch in his jaw, it was all there. But I wasn't done. I needed him to feel the weight of his actions, to realize how deep his betrayal ran. "You think you can just rewrite history, Jason?" I said quietly, leaning forward slightly, letting the words sink. "You've spent years treating me like I don't matter, like Mom's wishes don't matter. And now you've tried to steal them. Do you have any idea what that makes you?" His smirk faltered, and I could see him calculating, searching for a way out that didn't exist. The room felt smaller, charged, like every second stretched into eternity. I didn't flinch, didn't blink, and I could see the anger and fear battling in his expression. Dad remained silent, watching carefully, and for the first time, I felt a sense of control that I had never experienced in family confrontations before. Then Jason's face went pale. I didn't need to say anything else. The realization hit him that he couldn't charm, manipulate, or intimidate his way out of this one. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the papers, but I held them back, keeping control. The betrayal, the manipulation, the years of favoritism, they were all laid bare, and for the first time, Jason was powerless. And yet, even as I watched him falter, I knew the real breaking point wasn't just the documents or the evidence. It was the realization that he had underestimated me, that I had grown into someone he could no longer control. That moment of vulnerability, that flash of fear and desperation, was intoxicating in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't satisfaction yet. It was anticipation, the knowledge that the confrontation was only beginning, that the fallout from his actions would be even more devastating. I could feel my heart pounding, my mind racing with the possibilities. Jason would lash out, of course. He always did when cornered. But I was ready for that, too. The slow, deliberate planning, the careful preparation, it all led to this moment, and I could sense the power shifting in my favor. This was more than revenge. It was justice, long overdue. And then it happened. Jason reached for the stack of papers with a sudden, almost violent motion, his face twisting in anger and disbelief. But just as his fingers brushed the top sheet, I moved faster, pushing them away. His expression froze in shock, and for a heartbeat, the room was silent except for our breathing. I realized in that instant that everything had changed. The rules, the power, the family dynamics, all of it had shifted, and there was no going back. I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady but low, deliberate. One more step, Jason, and you won't like the consequences. You've already crossed the line. His eyes widened, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, frantically trying to figure out how to save face, how to regain control. But this time, there was nothing left for him to grab onto. The betrayal, the favoritism, the arrogance, it had all been exposed. And now, finally, it was time for him to face it. The moment Jason stormed out of my apartment that evening, slamming the door behind him as if trying to erase the evidence of his own humiliation, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The adrenaline that had kept me tense for hours began to ebb, leaving a hollow emptiness behind. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of everything that had been bottled up inside me. The small indignities, the constant dismissals, the way my family had systematically ignored my achievements, my feelings, and even my existence in favor of Jason's ego. And in that quiet, lonely apartment, I hit a kind of rock bottom I hadn't anticipated. Not because of what had just happened, but because I realized how much of my life I had let his entitlement and my family's passivity define. That night, I sat alone, staring at the empty space where the photos and signed papers had been laid out, now shoved back into their folders. My mind raced over every insult Jason had ever hurled, every sneer he had aimed at me, every time he had manipulated Dad or Aunt Miriam or even my distant cousins to make me feel invisible. And yet, beneath the anger and bitterness, a tiny spark of clarity began to form. I had spent decades living under the shadow of entitlement and favoritism, but no one, not Jason, not Dad, not anyone, could take from me what I hadn't willingly handed over. I realized that if I wanted my life to change, if I wanted respect, success, and a sense of self-worth, I couldn't wait for them to give it to me. I had to build it myself. The following days were quiet but purposeful. I started by reclaiming small pieces of my life that had been neglected. I reorganized my apartment, going through boxes of old documents, photos, and keepsakes, separating what mattered to me from what tied me emotionally to Jason's manipulations. Each item I sorted, each drawer I cleared, felt like a small act of rebellion against the years of undervaluation. I wasn't just decluttering a physical space. I was reclaiming my mind, my focus, my sense of self. Next, I turned to the career I had lost. Losing that job had been devastating, but in retrospect, It felt like an opportunity to start over without the constraints of the environment that had never truly appreciated me. I began dedicating myself to freelance work I had always wanted to explore, but had dismissed as impractical or not serious enough. Writing, consulting, small entrepreneurial projects. I approached them all with an intensity one had never allowed myself before. The first weeks were grueling. I struggled to find clients, to gain traction, to maintain a consistent schedule. But with each small success, each payment, each word of positive feedback, I felt the faintest stirrings of pride. Slowly, steadily, I began to feel like I was becoming someone capable of standing on my own. What surprised me most, however, wasn't the work itself, but the way I began to think differently about my family. Instead of obsessing over Jason's arrogance, his entitlement, and Dad's quiet complicity, I started seeing them for what they were, obstacles I had no obligation to entertain. I could acknowledge the hurt they had caused without letting it dictate my life. And with that perspective came a freedom I hadn't known I was missing. I could plan, act, and build without their interference looming over me. Weeks later, I received an unexpected email from a lawyer I had reached out to in the aftermath of the confrontation with Jason. The documents I had provided, combined with my meticulous notes on his interference, gave them a clear case to challenge his attempts to manipulate Mom's estate. They assured me that, legally, I was in a strong position. Reading the email, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: quiet confidence. I wasn't relying on luck, on emotional appeals, or on the pity of relatives. I had prepared, I had gathered evidence, and I had a path forward. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. During this period, I also started taking care of myself physically and mentally. I had always neglected my own health in the years of tension and emotional labor required to navigate my toxic family. I began running in the mornings, clearing my mind as I traced familiar paths through my neighborhood. I joined a small local gym, lifting weights and gradually building strength, feeling my body respond in ways that mirrored my growing inner resilience. I even started therapy, a step I had avoided because I didn't want to admit that my family had caused real, lasting damage. But the sessions became an anchor, a place where I could untangle decades of frustration, anxiety, and self-doubt. Each appointment left me stronger, more self-assured, and more ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Jason continued to try to meddle, sending passive-aggressive texts, hinting at family gatherings, and occasionally contacting distant relatives to spin his narrative. But I had stopped responding to his provocations. I realized that every interaction I engaged in with him previously had only fueled his sense of superiority and kept me emotionally tethered to his whims. By refusing to engage, I began to see him as the immature, entitled person he was, not a figure capable of dictating my life or my worth. During this rebuilding phase, I found unexpected allies in people I had always considered peripheral to my life. Friends, former colleagues, even extended family members who had quietly observed the dynamics but never felt empowered to speak up. Their support was subtle but powerful, a shared memory, a confirmation of events, or simply someone listening without judgment. It reminded me that my world didn't have to revolve around the toxic patterns of my immediate family. I could create a network of trust and respect that was independent of Jason's dominance or Dad's silence. I also started documenting everything meticulously. Notes, journals, digital records of communications. All of it served two purposes: as evidence against any future attempts by Jason to manipulate the situation further, and as a personal record of my own progress. Writing down my thoughts, my strategies, my victories, no matter how small, became a form of therapy, a way to chart the trajectory of my rise from the rock-bottom despair I had felt just weeks before. Gradually, the victories, both small and large, started accumulating. I landed a significant freelance contract that paid more than I had earned in my previous full-time role. I signed clients who valued my work and treated me as an equal, giving me autonomy I had never experienced in traditional employment. I began to see my own competence clearly, without the cloud of Jason's shadow hanging over me. Each project, each milestone, reinforced the idea that I was capable of creating a life independent of their drama, one built on my own choices and efforts. As my confidence grew, so did my willingness to assert boundaries more firmly. I started being selective about family interactions, attending gatherings only when necessary, and making it clear that Jason's presence would not be tolerated unless he behaved respectfully. It wasn't about being spiteful. It was about protecting the equilibrium I had worked so hard to establish. And every time he tried to cross the line, I had evidence, I had the law, and I had my own inner strength to counteract him. Through all of this, I learned an essential truth. Self-worth isn't granted by family, by recognition, or even by material success. It comes from action, from resilience, and from the refusal to allow toxic patterns to define who you are. By taking deliberate steps to rebuild, to focus on my career, my health, and my mental clarity, I began to cultivate a sense of security and purpose that Jason's arrogance could no longer shake. But just as the sense of rising from the ashes began to take hold, the calm was shattered by an unexpected twist. One evening, I received a call from Dad. His voice was quiet, hesitant, unusually careful. "Kyle, Jason's done something. He's gone further than I thought possible. You need to see this for yourself." My stomach sank. Despite all the progress I had made, despite all the strength I had cultivated, a cold dread settled over me. Jason had always been unpredictable, and now, it seemed, he was escalating. I drove to Dad's house that night, my mind racing with possibilities. The driveway was quiet, almost eerily so, and when I stepped inside, I immediately sensed that something was off. Dad sat at the kitchen table, holding an envelope in his hands. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes every step feel heavier than it should. He's trying to file documents claiming full control of Mom's estate," Dad said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "And he's got signatures, forged ones. You need to act fast." I felt a rush of anger, disbelief, and fear, all mingling at once. Jason had crossed the line again, pushing into criminal territory. But for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I had prepared for this. I had the evidence, and I had the resolve. I could handle him. And yet, even with that confidence, a part of me understood that the fallout from this betrayal would be seismic, not just legally, but emotionally. Jason had underestimated me, and now he would learn that his miscalculations had consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. I spent the next week living in a strange, focused bubble, partly driven by adrenaline, partly by the cold, methodical clarity that comes when you know the rules of the game and are determined to use them. The forged signatures were the provocation, but they had also given me something I hadn't had before: undeniable proof that Jason was willing to cross legal and moral lines to take what wasn't his. That knowledge changed everything. It made my anger practical. It made my plan possible. I started by building a perimeter. I cataloged every scrap of paper, every email, every message that could corroborate Mom's intentions and Jason's attempts to subvert them. I digitized copies of the original signed documents, those safe deposit photos I'd taken weeks earlier, the bank statements showing transfers he'd tried to manipulate, and the text messages where he'd admitted, more than once, that he was sorting things out his way. I stored encrypted backups on cloud accounts he'd never think to check, printed hard copies, and put them in a secure lockbox at a friend's place, and gave a trusted neighbor a key and simple instructions on who to contact if anything happened to me. Paranoia used to feel like a luxury. Now it felt like a necessary tool. Next, I professionalized everything. The lawyer who had initially encouraged me agreed to take the case after seeing the forgeries and the pattern of interference. He was a no-nonsense woman named Elena who cut through sentiment like a scalpel. She didn't coddle feelings, she treated facts. Over coffee in her cluttered office, she laid out the practicalities. What we need to freeze if Jason tried to file anything, how to get an emergency injunction, the timeline for filing suit, and the kind of evidence that would make a judge stop and take notice. She also warned me about the emotional fallout, about the ways lawsuits can drag out family relationships and become ugly in public. I appreciated the warning, but I'd already decided I'd rather have ugliness that ended with justice than polite silence that let a thief rewrite my mother's legacy. While Elena handled the legal front, I built a coalition. For years, I had assumed family meant a fixed set of people acting in predictable ways, but that assumption had been shattered. Loyalty in families is not binary. It's a web. I started identifying nodes in that web, people whose opinions still mattered in the family machine, but who had been marginalized by Jason's louder voice. Aunt Miriam, who'd always been quietly observant, admitted over tea that she'd suspected Jason of taking liberties but had been afraid of the fallout. Cousin Laura, who lived out of state and had been largely kept out of the family loop, texted me late one night. "If you want, I'll testify." I remember things Mom told me when she thought no one else was listening. Even Dad, after the initial shock and guilt, began to show a slow, clumsy willingness to help. It wasn't wholehearted at first. He had his own shame to work through, but he started to sign off on anything that would keep Jason from moving assets. I reached out to an unexpected ally as well, one of Jason's former business partners, a man named Derek who'd fallen out with him years ago over shady bookkeeping. I approached Derek carefully, knowing Jason would have burned bridges. At our first meeting, tucked in a quiet cafe, Derek's expression softened when I explained what was happening. "I've seen that side of him," he said quietly, more pity than surprise in his voice. "If you have proof, I'll help. I can pull records that show his pattern, his transfers, his fake invoices. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because he did the same thing to me." Derek provided bank statements and screenshots that filled in a gap I hadn't expected. The financial thread that showed Jason's behavior wasn't a single act of desperation, but a pattern. I also started to prepare for the psychological warfare I knew was coming. People like Jason don't give up easily. They double down. So I mapped out likely reactions and planned counters. If he tried to gaslight the family, I'd have sworn statements and witnesses ready. If he attempted to sabotage my reputation, I'd have public records and third-party confirmations to refute his claims. If he tried to turn Dad back into a silent enabler, I'd bring him into the loop with straightforward, simple facts, documents he could hold in his hands, not abstractions. The idea was to make deception hard and exposure inevitable. Financial stability was another pillar of the setup. Although my freelance work had been going well, I knew legal battles and family fallout could drain resources and time. I negotiated a couple of longer-term contracts and took on a small consulting gig that promised steady income. I tightened my budget, but I also invested strategically, hiring a forensic accountant on Elena's recommendation to analyze suspicious transfers and hiring a private investigator to verify a few key claims. That felt excessive at first, but when the PI returned with photos of Jason meeting with a notary I'd never heard of on the same day the forged documents supposedly came into being, the expense felt justified. There was a domestic element to my preparation, too. I changed passwords, updated security on accounts Mom had handled, and notified the bank and the attorney on record that I was the legitimate point of contact for certain affairs. I asked Dad to give me a list of any contacts he'd had with lawyers or banks, people who might be vulnerable to Jason's charm or pressure, and we called them together so there would be a clear paper trail showing who had been informed and when. Every small administrative act was a tiny victory, a lock changed, a signature witnessed, a call logged. Emotionally, I fortified myself in ways that surprised me. Where once I had measured my worth by my family's validation, I now drew strength from the way strangers and peripheral family members responded to the truth. I started journaling not to catalog evidence, but to record my values, what I would and would not accept, how I wanted to behave under pressure. I made rules for myself: no public attacks, no sensationalism on social media, no baiting. Elena agreed. She said anger was natural, but that a judge preferred dispassionate facts over performative outrage. That message became a kind of moral scaffold for me. I would be strategic, not vengeful. I wanted consequences for Jason, but not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Still, even with all the planning, there were personal risks. I had to prepare for being ostracized, for the possibility Dad would slip back into silence, for Jason to try to manufacture crises to distract everyone. I rehearsed conversations in my head. How to respond if an aunt accused me of making a mountain of a molehill. How to steady my voice if a cousin showed me a family photo and asked, "Are you sure?" I practiced not flinching when people tried to minimize what had happened. In those rehearsals, something else shifted. My fear gave way to a quiet steadiness. I began to relish the role of the person who would follow through, not because I wanted to punish, but because I believed in upholding what my mother had wanted. Slowly, deliberately, I set the trap. I arranged a family meeting under the pretense of sorting everything out with the estate. It was the perfect stage, a neutral space, witnesses present, a notary there to confirm signatures, and Elena available to advise. I told a few carefully chosen relatives, those I trusted, to attend, framing it as a family mediation. I made sure the date was when key allies could be present: Aunt Miriam, Cousin Laura, Derek, and the notary who'd handled some of Mom's paperwork years before. Dad agreed to be there, which felt almost miraculous. I gave him a simple brief: sit, listen, hand over the safe deposit key if asked, and don't be bullied. I bought myself small comforts in the days leading up to the meeting: new shirts, extra coffee, a playlist of songs that put me in the right mood. Steady, not frantic. I read through the documents with Elena twice, asking questions until I could answer every "what if" she posed. Each time I solved a potential loophole, my anxiety ebbed. Control, I discovered, is less about dominating people and more about eliminating surprises. The morning of the meeting dawned clear and oddly calm. I felt like a man about to walk into a crucible. Nervous, yes, but not naive. Dad arrived early, looking older than I remembered, his hands a little shakier when he handed me the safe deposit envelope. "Be fair," he said quietly, and it felt like an apology and a blessing in one. We arrived at the neutral venue together, an old community center room with large windows and a long table that seemed to amplify voices. People trickled in, Aunt Miriam with her soft eyes, Laura scanning the room as if measuring the scene, Derek with a guarded expression, and, last to enter, Jason, oiled smile in place, swagger barely contained. He acted like he'd already won. He sat down with that easy confidence and started with his usual charm: offensive jokes, false concern, a performance of wounded brotherly love. "Look at us, trying to sort out a messy misunderstanding," he said, smiling at Dad as if to cement an alliance. But the notary was there, Elena was to my left, and the documents were arranged. I felt the air change as the room realized this wasn't casual. This was official. I opened with a quiet statement of intent. No flourish, no theatrics. I explained why we were there, what had been found, and what we needed to resolve. Jason's face went through the micro-expressions I'd learned to read. First irritation, then anger, then the practiced facade of control. He tried to interject, to tell a version that painted me as unreasonable, but Elena cut him off with a calm, "We'll address your statements in order." That line was the hinge. It made the room lean into process over posturing. And then, just as I was about to hand over a folder of evidence to the notary and request that the bank freeze any attempted filings, the door to the meeting room opened, and Dad's neighbor, Mrs. Kostovic, who'd promised to come as a witness, stepped in with an envelope in her hand. Her face was pale. "I thought you should see this," she said, voice trembling. "I found it in Jason's car yesterday while bringing your mail back." I didn't want to believe it. She handed me a single sheet that none of us expected, a bank-certified letter that showed a recent transfer out of an account linked to Mom's estate, one that had been moved to a shell account with Jason's name on the file. The room went very quiet. Jason's jaw clenched, and for a split second I saw him. Not the charming brother, not the swaggering bully, but a small, cornered animal. My pulse quickened. This was the moment I had been preparing for. This was the perfect opportunity to corner him with a combination of legal proof, witnesses, and process. I felt Elena's hand brush mine, steady, invisible encouragement, and then Jason rose from his chair. I spent the next week living in a strange, focused bubble, partly driven by adrenaline, partly by the cold, methodical clarity that comes when you know the rules of the game and are determined to use them. The forged signatures were the provocation, but they had also given me something I hadn't had before: undeniable proof that Jason was willing to cross legal and moral lines to take what wasn't his. That knowledge changed everything. It made my anger practical. It made my plan possible. I started by building a perimeter. I cataloged every scrap of paper, every email, every message that could corroborate Mom's intentions and Jason's attempts to subvert them. I digitized copies of the original signed documents, those safe deposit photos I'd taken weeks earlier, the bank statements showing transfers he'd tried to manipulate, and the text messages where he'd admitted, more than once, that he was sorting things out his way. I stored encrypted backups on cloud accounts he'd never think to check, printed hard copies, and put them in a secure lockbox at a friend's place, and gave a trusted neighbor a key and simple instructions on who to contact if anything happened to me. Paranoia used to feel like a luxury. Now it felt like a necessary tool. Next, I professionalized everything. The lawyer who had initially encouraged me agreed to take the case after seeing the forgeries and the pattern of interference. He was a no-nonsense woman named Elena who cut through sentiment like a scalpel. She didn't coddle feelings, she treated facts. Over coffee in her cluttered office, she laid out the practicalities. What we'd need to freeze if Jason tried to file anything, how to get an emergency injunction, the timeline for filing suit, and the kind of evidence that would make a judge stop and take notice. She also warned me about the emotional fallout, about the ways lawsuits can drag out family relationships and become ugly in public. I appreciated the warning, but I'd already decided I'd rather have ugliness that ended with justice than polite silence that let a thief rewrite my mother's legacy. While Elena handled the legal front, I built a coalition. For years I had assumed family meant a fixed set of people acting in predictable ways, but that assumption had been shattered. Loyalty in families is not binary, it's a web. I started identifying nodes in that web, people whose opinions still mattered in the family machine, but who had been marginalized by Jason's louder voice. Aunt Miriam, who'd always been quietly observant, admitted over tea that she'd suspected Jason of taking liberties but had been afraid of the fallout. Cousin Laura, who lived out of state and had been largely kept out of the family loop, texted me late one night. "If you want, I'll testify." I remember things Mom told me when she thought no one else was listening. Even Dad, after the initial shock and guilt, began to show a slow, clumsy willingness to help. It wasn't wholehearted at first. He had his own shame to work through, but he started to sign off on anything that would keep Jason from moving assets. I reached out to an unexpected ally as well, one of Jason's former business partners, a man named Derek who'd fallen out with him years ago over shady bookkeeping. I approached Derek carefully, knowing Jason would have burned bridges. At our first meeting, tucked in a quiet cafe, Derek's expression softened when I explained what was happening. "I've seen that side of him," he said quietly, more pity than surprise in his voice. "If you have proof, I'll help. I can pull records that show his pattern, his transfers, his fake invoices. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because he did the same thing to me." Derek provided bank statements and screenshots that filled in a gap I hadn't expected. The financial thread that showed Jason's behavior wasn't a single act of desperation, but a pattern. I also started to prepare for the psychological warfare I knew was coming. People like Jason don't give up easily, they double down. So I mapped out likely reactions and planned counters. If he tried to gaslight the family, I'd have sworn statements and witnesses ready. If he attempted to sabotage my reputation, I'd have public records and third-party confirmations to refute his claims. If he tried to turn Dad back into a silent enabler, I'd bring him into the loop with straightforward, simple facts, documents he could hold in his hands, not abstractions. The idea was to make deception hard and exposure inevitable. Financial stability was another pillar of the setup. Although my freelance work had been going well, I knew legal battles and family fallout could drain resources and time. I negotiated a couple of longer-term contracts and took on a small consulting gig that promised steady income. I tightened my budget, but I also invested strategically, hiring a forensic accountant on Elena's recommendation to analyze suspicious transfers and hiring a private investigator to verify a few key claims. That felt excessive at first. But when the PI returned with photos of Jason meeting with a notary I'd never heard of on the same day the forged documents supposedly came into being, the expense felt justified. There was a domestic element to my preparation, too. I changed passwords, updated security on accounts Mom had handled, and notified the bank and the attorney on record that I was the legitimate point of contact for certain affairs. I asked Dad to give me a list of any contacts he'd had with lawyers or banks, people who might be vulnerable to Jason's charm or pressure, and we called them together so there would be a clear paper trail showing who had been informed and when. Every small administrative act was a tiny victory. A lock changed, a signature witnessed, a call logged. Emotionally, I fortified myself in ways that surprised me. Where once I had measured my worth by my family's validation, I now drew strength from the way strangers and peripheral family members responded to the truth. I started journaling not to catalog evidence, but to record my values, what I would and would not accept, how I wanted to behave under pressure. I made rules for myself: no public attacks, no sensationalism on social media, no baiting. Elena agreed. She said anger was natural, but that a judge preferred dispassionate facts over performative outrage. That message became a kind of moral scaffold for me. I would be strategic, not vengeful. I wanted consequences for Jason, but not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Still, even with all the planning, there were personal risks. I had to prepare for being ostracized, for the possibility Dad would slip back into silence, for Jason to try to manufacture crises to distract everyone. I rehearsed conversations in my head. How to respond if an aunt accused me of making a mountain of a molehill. How to steady my voice if a cousin showed me a family photo and asked, "Are you sure?" I practiced not flinching when people tried to minimize what had happened. In those rehearsals, something else shifted. My fear gave way to a quiet steadiness. I began to relish the role of the person who would follow through, not because I wanted to punish, but because I believed in upholding what my mother had wanted. Slowly, deliberately, I set the trap. I arranged a family meeting under the pretense of sorting everything out with the estate. It was the perfect stage, a neutral space, witnesses present, a notary there to confirm signatures, and Elena available to advise. I told a few carefully chosen relatives, those I trusted, to attend, framing it as a family mediation. I made sure the date was when key allies could be present: Aunt Miriam, Cousin Laura, Derek, and the notary who'd handled some of Mom's paperwork years before. Dad agreed to be there, which felt almost miraculous. I gave him a simple brief: sit, listen, hand over the safe deposit key if asked, and don't be bullied. I bought myself small comforts in the days leading up to the meeting: new shirts, extra coffee, a playlist of songs that put me in the right mood. Steady, not frantic. I read through the documents with Elena twice, asking questions until I could answer every "what if" she posed. Each time I solved a potential loophole, my anxiety ebbed. Control, I discovered, is less about dominating people and more about eliminating surprises. Jason's rise from smug arrogance to pale panic happened in seconds, like watching a mountain crumble in slow motion. Standing in that room, with the notary, Elena, Aunt Miriam, Cousin Laura, Derek, Dad, and Mrs. Kostovic as witnesses, I realized that everything I had spent months preparing, the research, the alliances, the legal groundwork, was about to pay off. My pulse was steady, my breath controlled. This was the moment every careful step, every strategic call, every late night spent planning had been leading to. Jason fumed, his hands gripping the back of his chair as if it could anchor him against the storm of consequences crashing down. He opened his mouth, probably intending a snide comment, but Elena cut in first, calm and precise. "Jason, everything Kyle presented is verifiable, documented, and legally actionable. Your attempts to manipulate the estate are not only void, they're criminal. Forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, deceptive filings. They leave you no room for plausible deniability." Her words landed like hammers, final and uncompromising. I stepped forward slowly, holding the folder of evidence I had organized with almost obsessive precision. "Jason," I said, my voice quiet but icy, You've spent your entire life thinking you could rewrite reality, bend it to your will, and intimidate anyone who opposed you. Today that ends. Every forgery, every lie, every manipulation. You tried to erase decades of my life, our mother's intentions, and even basic fairness. And today, you are accountable. He sneered, but the confidence was hollow. I had expected him to argue, to launch into a tirade, to charm his way out. But the room had shifted. The witnesses were neutral, informed, and firm. The notary had the papers, Elena had legal authority, and I had meticulous documentation. Jason realized this wasn't a negotiation. It was an inescapable reckoning. I handed the notary a set of documents, neatly organized, highlighting each fraudulent act. These are copies of every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer, and the communications that prove intent. We're submitting them to the court today. Any attempt to dispute them without evidence will fail, and any interference with the process will be considered contempt. The silence was deafening. Jason's face shifted through disbelief, anger, and finally the pale panic I had been waiting for. He had never encountered a situation where his manipulations couldn't succeed. For the first time, he realized that charm, intimidation, and entitlement had limits. Aunt Miriam leaned forward, her voice quiet but pointed. Jason, I've watched you exploit, lie, and manipulate for years. Not just to me, not just to Kyle, but to Mom. You don't get to continue that legacy. You've been given your chance, and you blew it. Cousin Laura added, we believed Mom wanted fairness, not favoritism. And Kyle, he's done nothing but honor her wishes. You've gone too far, and now everyone here sees it. Dad, sitting quietly until now, finally spoke. His voice trembled slightly, but it carried authority. Jason, you've made choices that I didn't fully stop before. I thought staying silent was safer, easier. I was wrong. Today, you face the consequences of your actions. I will no longer enable your manipulations. Jason's smirk dissolved into a twitching, uncertain frown. He glanced at the envelopes, the papers, the witnesses, and finally, at me. You can't do this, he muttered, though there was no conviction in the words. I shook my head slowly. I don't need to do anything, Jason. The law, the truth, and every person in this room ensure that your actions cannot succeed. You've cornered yourself, and now the consequences are inevitable. You've underestimated me, underestimated Mom, underestimated the people you thought were loyal. And that's the only mistake you can't recover from. Elena gestured to the notary, who began officially recording the evidence. The documents were signed, verified, and time-stamped. Every fraudulent transfer was flagged, every forged signature notarized as invalid. Every attempt Jason had made to manipulate the estate exposed in meticulous detail. Derek provided corroborating financial records. Aunt Miriam and Cousin Laura gave sworn statements about past incidents, and Dad's account verified the rightful ownership of assets. I watched Jason's face as the weight of the legal and social collapse sank in. His eyes darted, searching for a loophole, a witness, anything to regain leverage, but there was none. Each fact was unassailable, each ally unwavering, each document an airtight pillar of truth. The smugness that had defined him for decades evaporated. He was reduced to a man trapped by his own greed and arrogance. And then came the final blow. The bank confirmed that all pending transfers had been frozen, any unauthorized withdrawals reversed, and any filings Jason attempted would be legally null. The reality hit him like a physical force. He slumped into his chair, pale, quiet, utterly defeated. I took a step closer, keeping my voice calm, deliberate. This isn't about humiliation, Jason. It's about accountability. You thought you could erase me, rewrite Mom's legacy, and manipulate the people around you. You failed, and now you must live with the consequences of every choice you've made. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. The room's silence pressed against him like a weight he couldn't lift. For the first time, I saw the human underneath the mask, a man terrified of exposure, stripped of entitlement, powerless in the face of the law and family united against deception. As the witnesses began leaving, Elena handed me a folder with the finalized records and a short, professional smile. Everything is documented. You're fully protected. You've done this legally, methodically, and smartly. No chance for retaliation. I nodded, relief mixing with satisfaction. Months of careful planning, late nights, and meticulous preparation had culminated in this moment. Jason's empire of manipulation had crumbled, not with shouting or threats, but with precision, patience, and truth. Even Dad, whose silence had haunted me for decades, gave a small, rare smile. You handled this well. Mom would be proud. I felt a warmth in that acknowledgement, a quiet validation that no victory over Jason alone could have offered. The final act came quietly but decisively. Jason left the room, escorted by Derek to ensure he didn't attempt any immediate interference. His last glance at me was a mixture of disbelief, shame, and rage, emotions he would carry for a long time, and ones that would remind him of his failure every time he tried to claim authority over our family. After the door closed behind him, I finally exhaled fully. The weight of years, decades even, of frustration, betrayal, and undervaluation lifted in a single, liberating moment. My life, my mother's intentions, and my own dignity were restored. I looked around the room at the allies who had stood with me. Aunt Miriam, Cousin Laura, Derek, Elena, Dad. They weren't just witnesses. They were the embodiment of truth and fairness, and their presence confirmed that the right path, however difficult, had prevailed. I gathered the documents, carefully filing them in a secure place, knowing that they represented more than legal protection. They were a testament to perseverance, strategy, and patience. Every moment of planning, every sleepless night, every meticulous note had culminated in this undeniable reality. Jason's power was broken. As I finally stepped outside into the evening air, a quiet calm settled over me. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the street, but I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of true agency, the satisfaction of having acted with intelligence, restraint, and precision. My family's drama, my mother's legacy, my own self-respect, they were finally intact, safeguarded by strategy and unwavering resolve. And as I stood there, watching the sky turn gold, I realized one final truth. No amount of entitlement, arrogance, or manipulation can withstand careful preparation, unwavering conviction, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The past had tried to define me, my brother had tried to erase me, and even my father's silence had threatened to keep me small. But in the end, I had risen, not with rage, not with impulsive confrontation, but with patience, intelligence, and truth. Jason would carry the memory of this defeat with him forever. And me? I walked away lighter, stronger, and finally free, knowing that some victories aren't loud or dramatic. They're quiet, meticulous, and complete. The weight of his betrayal had been turned into the foundation of my triumph, and I knew, deep in my bones, that no one would ever undermine me again. The final line, whispered to myself as I locked the door behind me, was simple but resolute. I had finally taken my life back, and no one, not even him, could touch it again.